The boardroom fell silent when Katherine Hayes walked in with him. Not the polished executive they expected. Not the wealthy investor whispered about in corridors. A man in worn jeans and a faded jacket, calloused hands gripping a backpack that smelled faintly of coffee and kids' lunch. 58 years old, she had built an empire, while the world branded her too successful, too cold, too late for love. He was 52, raising a daughter alone, fixing computers in cramped apartments to keep the lights on. 6 years between them felt like 6 different worlds in the eyes of everyone watching. The whispers started immediately, harsh, cutting, unforgiving. But what Katherine did next, what Derek dared to believe, would shatter every assumption about who deserves love and who gets to decide. Because when two people the world calls mismatched choose each other, the real question isn't whether they fit. It's whether anyone else is brave enough to watch. Katherine Hayes had learned to read a room before anyone spoke. 27 years building tech vision solutions from a garage startup to a $400 million company had taught her that much. The glass walls of her corner office on the 42nd floor reflected a woman who had everything the world said mattered: power, wealth, respect. But the reflection never showed what she came home to each night. A penthouse apartment so quiet she could hear the hum of the refrigerator. A king-sized bed that felt too large for one person. A kitchen where the coffee maker was the only appliance that got daily use. At 58, Katherine had stopped counting the number of times people asked about her personal life with that particular tone of pity mixed with judgment, as if success and loneliness were somehow the same thing. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, though the marriage had ended long before the papers were signed. Robert had wanted a wife who attended charity galas and hosted dinner parties, someone who smiled for cameras and knew when to let him take credit for her ideas. Katherine had wanted a partner who understood why she couldn't leave the office at 5, why building something meaningful required sacrifice, why ambition wasn't a character flaw. Neither of them had been willing to bend, and so they had broken instead. The media had spun it as the Ice Queen's latest failure. Another headline about a woman too focused on her career to maintain a relationship. She had stopped reading the articles after the first dozen. What they wrote didn't change the truth. She was tired of being alone, but she refused to settle for anything less than genuine connection. The day Derek Foster walked into her life, Katherine had been in the middle of what her assistant Brenda called a Category 5 crisis. The entire company's server system had crashed at 9 in the morning, taking with it 3 years of proprietary research data and the presentations for a pitch meeting scheduled for 2 that afternoon. The IT department was scrambling, their faces pale with panic, speaking in technical jargon that might as well have been a foreign language. Brenda had called every tech support company in the city, finally reaching a freelance technician who could come immediately. Katherine had barely looked up when the man arrived, her attention fixed on the dead laptop screen that mocked her with its blank darkness. Derek's voice had cut through the chaos with unexpected calm. No panic, no corporate jargon, just a quiet question about whether she had backup systems in place. She had glanced up then, taking in the man crouched beside her desk with a worn tool bag and an expression of focused concentration. He was older than most of the tech guys who cycled through the building, silver threading through dark hair he kept tied back, lines around his eyes that spoke of late nights and early mornings. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he opened the laptop, fingers confident despite the calluses that marked them as belonging to someone who worked with more than just keyboards. There was something steadying about his presence, a kind of unflappable competence that made the crisis feel manageable for the first time that morning. It took him 4 hours to recover the data, working through lunch without complaint, while Katherine's team hovered anxiously in the background. She had stayed in the office the entire time, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. He spoke softly when he worked, occasionally explaining what he was doing in terms simple enough for her to understand. never condescending or impatient when she asked questions. At one point, his phone had buzzed, and she had seen his expression soften as he glanced at the screen. A text from someone named Rosie asking if he would be home for dinner. He had typed back quickly, promising to bring pizza, adding a heart emoji before tucking the phone away. The gesture had been so natural, so full of quiet affection, that Katherine had felt something shift in her chest. When the data finally appeared on screen, her entire team had erupted in relieved cheers. Derek had simply closed his tool bag, refusing the bonus she offered with a gentle shake of his head. The standard rate was fine, he had said. He was just glad he could help. As he turned to leave, Katherine had found herself asking if he had a business card, some way to reach him if they needed tech support again. He had pulled a slightly crumpled card from his wallet, apologizing for the bent corner with an embarrassed smile. The card read, Foster Tech Services, with a phone number and email address. Nothing fancy, just honest work offered without pretense. She had held it carefully, aware that this was more than just a professional contact, though she couldn't have explained why. The office felt different after Derek left, as if his quiet presence had exposed the hollowness Katherine had been ignoring for years. That night, alone in her penthouse, she had found herself thinking about the way his face had changed when he looked at that text message, the unguarded love in such a simple exchange. When was the last time anyone had looked forward to her coming home? When had she last felt that kind of uncomplicated joy in another person's company? The questions followed her into restless sleep, and she woke with a strange certainty that something had shifted, that the carefully constructed walls around her life had developed their first crack. 3 weeks later, Katherine called Derek again. The laptop was working fine. She just needed someone to set up a new security system for her home office. It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. But he had agreed to come on a Saturday morning, arriving at her building with the same worn tool bag and calm demeanor. They had talked while he worked, conversation flowing easier than it should have between a CEO and a freelance technician. He told her about Rosie, his 12-year-old daughter, who loved science and hated math, who could recite entire episodes of nature, documentaries, but forgot to turn in her homework. The way he spoke about her was like listening to someone describe their favorite piece of music, every detail precious, every quirk celebrated. Katherine had found herself sharing things she rarely told anyone, about growing up in a small town where ambition was viewed with suspicion, where wanting more than what your parents had was seen as a betrayal, about building her company from nothing, the nights she had slept on the office floor because she couldn't afford both rent and inventory, the investors who had laughed at a woman proposing tech solutions. She told him about the loneliness that came with success, how the higher she climbed, the smaller her world became, until she was surrounded by people who wanted things from her, but never seemed to see her. Derek had listened without trying to fix anything, without offering empty platitudes or advice. He had simply nodded, his eyes reflecting an understanding that came from his own hard-won experience. When he finished the installation, Derek had hesitated at the door, hands shoved in his pockets, in a gesture that made him look younger than his 52 years. He asked if she might want to grab coffee sometime, quickly adding that he understood if she was too busy, that he knew he wasn't the kind of person someone like her usually spent time with. Katherine had felt anger flash through her at that qualifier. Someone like her, hating how the world had taught him to see himself as less worthy. She had said yes immediately, more forcefully than she intended, watching relief and something warmer flood his expression. They made plans for the following Tuesday, a small coffee shop he knew in a neighborhood far from the downtown core, where no one would recognize her. The location felt significant somehow, a deliberate step away from her carefully managed public image. That first coffee had turned into 3 hours of conversation that ranged from favorite books to childhood dreams to the strange experience of raising a child alone. Derek told her about losing his wife 7 years ago to cancer, how Rosie had been 5 and barely understood why her mother wasn't coming home. He spoke about the impossible choice between his career as a software engineer and being present for his grieving daughter. How he had ultimately walked away from the job that demanded 60-hour weeks and constant travel. The decision had cost him everything he had built professionally, but it had given him the chance to be the parent Rosie needed. He said it without bitterness or regret, simply stating the facts of a life rebuilt around what mattered most. Katherine had shared her own story of compromise and loss, the ways ambition had shaped and scarred her. She told him about the baby she had miscarried at 32, the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of grief they couldn't share, the years she had poured into her company because building something felt safer than risking her heart again. Derek had reached across the table then, covering her hand with his own, and the touch had been like coming home to a place she didn't know she had been searching for. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who had learned to carry their wounds privately, finding unexpected comfort in shared understanding. The coffee shop meetings became a weekly ritual, then twice weekly, then whenever they could carve out time from their different worlds. Katherine learned that Derek was an extraordinary father, but a terrible cook, that he sang off-key in the car and cried during animated movies, that he had a laugh that started quiet and built until his whole body shook with it. She discovered that he read poetry before bed, that he volunteered at the library, teaching seniors how to use computers, that he believed in second chances and the inherent goodness of people even when the world proved him wrong. Every detail she learned made her feel like she was reading a book she never wanted to finish, each page revealing depths she hadn't expected. Derek saw parts of Katherine that nobody else had been allowed near. The woman who kept dark chocolate in her desk drawer and ate it when she was stressed, who had memorized her employees' birthdays and their children's names, who donated anonymously to scholarships for first-generation college students. He noticed how she deflected compliments, but absorbed criticism like blows, how she worked herself to exhaustion rather than ask for help, how she assumed people's interest in her was always transactional. When he told her she was beautiful, she had laughed it off, and he had insisted gently but firmly until she believed he meant it. Not beautiful in the polished, professional way the world saw her, but beautiful in her passion, her intelligence, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward the people she cared about. 6 months into their friendship, though both of them knew it had become more than that, Derek invited Katherine to dinner at his apartment. Nothing fancy, he had warned, just spaghetti, and the chance to meet Rosie properly. Katherine had changed outfits 4 times that evening, anxiety tightening her chest in a way board meetings never managed. What if Rosie didn't like her? What if the girl saw her as an intruder, someone trying to replace the mother she had lost? The thought spiraled until Katherine forced herself to stop, to remember that Derek wouldn't have asked if he didn't believe it would be okay. She showed up with flowers for the apartment and a book about marine biology for Rosie, hands trembling slightly as she knocked on the door. Rosie had answered with paint-stained fingers and a gap-toothed smile. Immediately pulling Katherine inside to show her the watercolor she was working on for her art class. The apartment was small but warm, lived in a way Katherine's penthouse could never be, with crayon drawings held to the refrigerator by magnets and photographs covering every available surface. Derek cooked, while Rosie talked a mile a minute about dolphins and coral reefs and the science fair project she was planning, barely pausing for breath, her enthusiasm infectious. Katherine found herself relaxing, drawn into the easy rhythm of their life, the way they moved around each other with practiced coordination, the casual affection in every interaction. Dinner was chaotic and perfect. Rosie asked Katherine approximately 1,000 questions, from what it was like to be a CEO to whether she had ever met anyone famous to, if she thought sea otters or river otters were cuter. Derek kept apologizing for his daughter's nosiness, but Katherine loved it, loved being seen as a person rather than a position, loved the way this 12-year-old girl treated her like a potential friend, rather than someone to be impressed or intimidated by. When Rosie mentioned offhandedly that her dad seemed happier lately, that he smiled more and didn't look so tired, Derek had turned bright red, and Katherine had felt warmth spread through her chest like sunrise. After Rosie went to bed, Katherine and Derek sat on the small balcony, drinking cheap wine and watching the city lights. She told him she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this content. This present in a moment without thinking about tomorrow's schedule or next quarter's projections. He said he had been scared to introduce her to Rosie, afraid that crossing that threshold would change everything. But now he couldn't imagine not having her here. The vulnerability in his voice made Katherine's throat tight. She reached for his hand, threading their fingers together, and acknowledged aloud what they had both been dancing around for months. This was more than friendship, more than casual connection, something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. The kiss happened naturally, inevitably. Derek's hand gentle against her cheek as he leaned in. It was soft and slow and tasted like wine and possibility. And when they pulled apart, Katherine felt tears on her face without shame. She was 58 years old and kissing a man on a balcony like a teenager, and it felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. Derek wiped her tears with his thumb, asking if she was okay, and she had laughed through the emotion, saying she was more than okay. She was terrified and hopeful and so deeply happy she didn't know what to do with it all. He had pulled her close then, holding her against his chest, while the city hummed below them, and Katherine let herself believe that maybe the world had been wrong about her all along. The relationship they built was deliberately private at first. Katherine wasn't ashamed, but she knew what would happen when the world found out. The speculation, the judgment, the inevitable dissection of every choice they made. Derek understood without her having to explain. Content to exist in the quiet spaces they carved out together. They had breakfast at diners where nobody knew her name, took Rosie to museums on Sunday mornings, spent evenings at his apartment, cooking dinner and doing homework and pretending the outside world didn't exist. It was a kind of happiness Katherine had stopped believing was possible for her. Simple and domestic and achingly real. But secrets in a small world have a way of surfacing. 3 months into their relationship, one of Katherine's board members saw them at a park, Derek pushing Rosie on the swings, while Katherine watched with an expression that was unmistakably tender. The board member had nodded politely, said nothing in the moment, but Katherine had felt the weight of that recognition like a stone in her stomach. By Monday morning, the whispers had started. Brenda reported hearing speculation in the break room, carefully vague questions about Katherine's personal life, comments about her seeming distracted lately, happier, different. Katherine had prepared for this, but preparation didn't make it easier. The gossip reached critical mass when someone from HR mentioned seeing Katherine's car parked overnight in a neighborhood that was decidedly not where she lived. The rumor mill spun faster, fueled by curiosity and the kind of petty judgment that thrived in corporate environments. Who was she seeing? Why the secrecy? Was it someone inappropriate? Someone who would embarrass the company? Katherine weathered it with the same steel spine that had built her empire, refusing to confirm or deny, keeping her expression neutral in meetings, even as she felt the speculation pressing in from all sides. But she knew it was only a matter of time before someone decided to dig deeper. Derek felt the change before she told him. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she checked her phone constantly, the forced casualness when she suggested they skip their usual Wednesday dinner. When he asked directly if he was the problem, if being with him was causing trouble, Katherine had broken. She told him about the whispers, the speculation, the way her professional reputation was being weighed against her personal choices. She explained that some of the board members already questioned her decisions, saw her as too emotional, too old to be leading a tech company into the future. A relationship with a freelance technician, a man 6 years younger with a child, and no corporate credentials. would be ammunition for anyone looking to push her out. Derek had gone very quiet, his expression closing off in a way Katherine had never seen. He asked if she was ashamed of him, if what they had was worth less than her company's approval, and the hurt in his voice had cut deeper than any boardroom criticism. She had grabbed his hands, forcing him to look at her, insisting that she wasn't ashamed, that she was angry, at the world for judging them, at the double standards that would celebrate a man in her position dating anyone he chose, but scrutinized her every personal decision. She told him she was terrified of losing him, but also terrified of the cost of keeping him, of what it might mean for the company she had spent her life building, for the employees who depended on her leadership. The confession felt like standing naked in front of him, every fear and weakness exposed. He had held her while she cried, something Katherine rarely allowed herself to do. When the tears stopped, Derek had asked what she wanted, truly wanted, stripped of all the external pressure and expectation. Katherine had thought about his question, really sat with it, and realized that what she wanted was him. She wanted Sunday mornings with Rosie, wanted the way he looked at her like she was precious, wanted to stop hiding something that made her happier than she had been in decades. She wanted to be brave enough to choose love over appearances, to trust that the company she had built could withstand her being fully human. Saying it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff, but Derek's arms around her felt like safety net enough. The decision to go public was Katherine's, made carefully and deliberately. She didn't announce it with fanfare or dramatics, simply showed up to the quarterly board meeting with Derek beside her. Let them see. Let them judge. Let them make their assessments based on reality rather than speculation. The boardroom had gone silent when she walked in, every eye tracking the man in jeans and a blazer he had clearly bought for the occasion, his hand steady against the small of her back. Katherine had felt the shock ripple through the room, the quick calculations happening behind polished professional masks. She had introduced Derek simply, without apology or excessive explanation, and watched the board members struggle to reconcile their assumptions with the quiet dignity of the man before them. The meeting had been brutal. Questions came wrapped in concerns about optics and company image, thinly veiled suggestions that Katherine's personal life was affecting her professional judgment. One board member, Gregory Patterson, had been particularly aggressive, implying that at her age, she should be focused on succession planning rather than romantic entanglements, that this relationship suggested a lack of seriousness about the company's future. Katherine had listened with mounting fury, jaw tight, feeling Derek's presence beside her like an anchor. When Gregory finished his thinly veiled attack, she had responded with a precision that made several people flinch. She reminded the board that her personal life had never interfered with her ability to grow the company, that Tech Vision's profits had increased 47% in the last 3 years under her leadership, that every major innovation they had brought to market had been her vision. She pointed out that male CEOs dated, married, and divorced without facing questions about their commitment to their companies, that her age and gender were being weaponized against her in ways that would never be tolerated if she were a man. Katherine's voice had remained level, professional, but there was steel beneath the words, a clear line drawn about what she would and would not accept. Derek had sat quietly through it all, his presence a statement in itself. He wasn't going anywhere, wasn't intimidated by their scrutiny or their judgment. The room had shifted after her response. Some board members looked uncomfortable, forced to confront their own biases reflected back at them. Others remained skeptical, but the overt hostility had diminished, replaced by an uneasy acknowledgement that Katherine had called their bluff. The meeting concluded with no resolution, just a tacit agreement to table the discussion, which felt like a hollow victory at best. As they left the building, Derek had asked if she was okay, and Katherine had surprised herself by laughing, sharp and a little wild, the sound of someone who had jumped and discovered they could fly. She had done it. She had chosen him in front of everyone, and the world hadn't ended. But the aftermath proved more complicated than a single meeting. The business media picked up the story within days, running articles with headlines that ranged from mildly curious to outright cruel. Tech CEO's surprising romance was one of the kinder versions. Others questioned her judgment, speculated about gold digging, suggested she was having a midlife crisis or desperately clinging to youth through an inappropriate relationship. The comment sections were predictably vicious, full of strangers who felt entitled to opinions about her life, her choices, her worth as a woman over 50. Katherine had told herself she wouldn't read them, but curiosity and masochism had won out, and she had spent one miserable evening scrolling through dozens of variations on the same cruel theme. She was too old, too successful, too intimidating to inspire genuine love. Derek weathered his own storm. Parents at Rosie's school whispered when he dropped her off, speculation running wild about the older woman he was seeing. Questions about whether it was appropriate, whether he was being taken advantage of, or perhaps taking advantage himself. Some of his longtime clients canceled contracts, uncomfortable with the attention, or perhaps with the idea of a man who didn't know his place. The loss of income was significant, enough to make the following month's rent a genuine concern, but Derek refused to let Katherine help financially. This was his choice too, he insisted, and he would carry the consequences without leaning on her money. The pride in his refusal was something Katherine understood deeply, even as it frustrated her to watch him struggle. Rosie surprised them both with her resilience. At 12, she was old enough to understand the gossip, young enough to be hurt by it, but fierce enough to defend what she knew to be true. When a classmate made a snide comment about her dad dating someone rich to avoid working, Rosie had apparently delivered a lecture about her father's work ethic that left the other kid in tears and earned her a trip to the principal's office. Derek had tried to be stern about the incident, but Katherine had seen the pride beneath his concern. This girl had inherited her father's fierce heart, his unwavering loyalty, and she was choosing to extend that loyalty to Katherine without reservation. The knowledge was both humbling and terrifying. The worst came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Katherine's ex-husband Robert reached out, ostensibly to check on her well-being after seeing the news coverage. The conversation had quickly turned ugly, Robert suggesting that she was embarrassing herself, that dating someone so clearly beneath her station made her look desperate and pathetic. He had always known she would regret prioritizing her career, he said, and now here she was, settling for scraps in her old age because no one appropriate would have her. Katherine had ended the call with shaking hands, Robert's words burrowing under her skin, despite knowing they came from his own bitterness and regret. The cruelty was the point, she knew, but it still landed with devastating accuracy on her deepest insecurities. She had shown up at Derek's apartment that night without calling ahead, makeup smudged from crying. The careful composure she maintained for the world completely shattered. He had taken one look at her and pulled her inside, asking no questions, just holding her on his worn couch while she fell apart. Rosie had appeared in her pajamas, concerned and uncertain, and Katherine had tried to compose herself, to be appropriate and adult. But the girl had simply climbed onto the couch beside her and said that people were mean sometimes, that they said things to hurt you because they were hurting inside, and the best thing to do was remember who actually mattered. The wisdom from a 12-year-old had broken something loose in Katherine's chest, and she had cried harder, but differently, surrounded by the two people who saw her as worth loving. Later, after Rosie went back to bed, Derek asked what had happened. Katherine told him about Robert's call, the specific words he had used, the way they had sliced through years of carefully constructed confidence. She confessed that part of her worried Robert was right, that she was being selfish and foolish, that she was risking everything for a relationship that the world would never accept. Derek had listened without interrupting, his hand steady against her back, and when she finished, He had asked a single question. Was she happy? Not in spite of the difficulty, but genuinely, deeply happy with him and Rosie and the life they were building together? Katherine had nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and Derek had said that was the only thing that mattered, that everything else was just noise from people who couldn't understand what they had. The turning point came from an unlikely advocate. Brenda, Katherine's assistant of 15 years, requested a meeting with the board of directors. Katherine only learned about it after the fact. When Brenda appeared in her office looking nervous but determined, she explained that she had spent 3 hours presenting data to the board about Katherine's performance metrics, employee satisfaction scores, and company growth under her leadership. Brenda had brought receipts, literally printed spreadsheets and graphs, showing that Katherine had never been more effective as a CEO than in the past 6 months, that her decision-making had been sharp and her strategic vision clearer than ever. The implication was obvious. Whatever was happening in Katherine's personal life was making her better at her job, not worse. But Brenda hadn't stopped there. She had told the board, in her precise and professional way, that she was disgusted by their treatment of a woman who had given everything to build their company, who had made them all wealthy beyond measure, and who deserved the basic human dignity of choosing her own happiness without being interrogated like a criminal. She had pointed out that several board members had been married multiple times, that others had children from affairs, that the moral high ground they claimed when discussing Katherine was built on hypocrisy. Brenda had finished by saying that if they forced Katherine to choose between her personal life and her position, they would be making the biggest mistake in the company's history, because Katherine Hayes was irreplaceable and they all knew it. Katherine had listened to Brenda's recounting with something close to shock. Her assistant had put her own job on the line, had spoken truth to power in a way that could have ended her career, all to defend Katherine's right to love who she chose. When she asked why, Brenda had shrugged with uncharacteristic emotion and said that, in 15 years, she had never seen Katherine as happy or as human as she had been in recent months, and that was worth fighting for. The friendship Katherine hadn't fully acknowledged or appreciated revealed itself as something deeper, a loyalty earned through years of mutual respect and quiet understanding. She had hugged Brenda, something she almost never did with employees, and felt the woman hug her back just as tightly. The board's response came 2 days later in the form of a formal statement. They expressed confidence in Katherine's leadership, acknowledged that her personal life was her own business, and committed to focusing on the company's continued growth and innovation. It was corporate speak, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault, but it was also a capitulation. The board had blinked first, unwilling to risk losing their most valuable asset over something as inconsequential as who she loved. Katherine read the statement 3 times, hardly believing it was real, feeling a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged lift from her shoulders. She had won, not just the battle, but the right to live her life without choosing between success and happiness. Derek's reaction was quieter, but no less profound. When she told him, he had pulled her into his arms and held her for a long moment, and she felt the tension drain from his body, tension she hadn't realized he had been carrying. He told her he had been prepared to walk away if it came to that he would never let her sacrifice what she had built for him, but that he was grateful beyond words that it hadn't been necessary. The admission hurt and healed simultaneously, knowing he would have let her go, understanding that his love included the willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for hers. It was the kind of selfless devotion Katherine had stopped believing existed outside of movies. They celebrated that weekend with a proper date, the first time they had gone out publicly in the city where Katherine was known. Derek made reservations at a restaurant she loved, a place with exposed brick and candlelight and food that was more art than sustenance. Katherine dressed carefully, not hiding, but not flaunting either, striking a balance that felt true to who she was. When they walked in together, she felt eyes turn their direction, saw recognition flicker across faces, waited for the judgment. But something had shifted. Maybe it was Brenda's defense. Maybe it was the board's statement. Maybe it was simply that people were moving on to other gossip. Whatever the reason, the attention felt different, curious rather than cruel, interested rather than condemning. Dinner was perfect in its imperfection. Derek was nervous in the fancy restaurant, unsure which fork to use and self-conscious about the wine list, and Katherine found it endearing rather than embarrassing. She told him stories about disastrous business dinners, about the time she had spilled an entire glass of red wine on a potential investor's white suit, about learning that confidence mattered more than knowing every rule of etiquette. He relaxed as the evening progressed, his natural charm emerging as he told her about teaching Rosie to ride a bike, about the father-daughter camping trip that had ended with them lost in the woods for 6 hours, about the small joys and disasters that made up a life lived fully and honestly. As they left the restaurant, Derek took her hand on the sidewalk, a simple gesture made profound by its publicity. Katherine felt her breath catch, aware of the statement they were making just by walking together, fingers intertwined, in a part of the city where she was CEO first and person second. But Derek's grip was steady, his presence beside her a reminder that she wasn't navigating this alone, that choosing love didn't mean abandoning strength. They walked several blocks like that, talking and laughing, and Katherine realized with startling clarity that this was what happiness looked like. Not grand gestures or perfect moments, but the simple comfort of being wholly yourself with someone who chose to stay. The months that followed weren't without challenges. There were still whispers, still people who questioned their relationship, still moments when Katherine doubted whether she deserved this kind of happiness. But there were also Sunday breakfasts, with Rosie practicing her presentation skills on them, Derek falling asleep on her couch with his head in her lap, quiet evenings where they existed in comfortable silence while she worked and he read. The life they built was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, revolutionary in its refusal to apologize for existing. Katherine learned to let Derek support her emotionally, even when she couldn't accept financial help, learned to be vulnerable without feeling weak, learned that love didn't diminish her, but expanded her in ways she hadn't known were possible. Rosie had her own journey with the situation. There were hard conversations about what it meant for Katherine to be in their lives, whether she was trying to replace the mother Rosie had lost, how to navigate the complicated emotions of loving someone new without betraying the memory of someone gone. Katherine had approached these conversations with the same careful attention she brought to board meetings, listening more than she spoke, validating Rosie's feelings without trying to fix them too quickly. She told the girl that she wasn't trying to be her mother, that no one could or should replace that, but that she hoped they could find their own kind of relationship, something unique to them. Rosie had thought about it for a long time before nodding slowly, and Katherine had understood that trust was being offered, tentatively, but genuinely. The relationship that developed between Katherine and Rosie was different from what she had imagined parenting might be. She wasn't trying to be mom or even stepmom, more like a mentor and friend who happened to care deeply about Rosie's well-being. They bonded over shared interests, science, business strategy, the satisfaction of solving complex problems. Katherine taught Rosie about negotiation and leadership, helped her prepare for the science fair with the same intensity she brought to product launches. Rosie taught Katherine about letting go of control, about finding joy in mistakes, about the freedom that came from not having to be perfect all the time. They balanced each other in unexpected ways, and watching Derek observe their interactions with soft-eyed wonder made Katherine fall in love with him even deeper. 6 months after going public with their relationship, Katherine stood in front of the entire company at their annual meeting and did something she had never done before. She talked about her personal life, not extensively, not making it the focus, but acknowledging that she had found happiness with someone who reminded her why the work mattered, who showed her that success was hollow without people to share it with. She thanked the employees who had supported her through a difficult period, acknowledged that she was still learning how to balance professional excellence with personal fulfillment, and promised that Tech Vision would continue to be led by someone who understood both the cost and the value of following your heart. The applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition she usually received, warmer and more genuine, as if her humanity had made her more relatable rather than less respected. Derek attended that meeting at Katherine's invitation, sitting in the back with Rosie beside him, both of them looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Katherine had caught his eye during her speech, seen the pride and love there, and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with approval or validation from anyone else. After the meeting, employees had approached them, not with judgment, but with congratulations and curiosity, wanting to meet the man who had managed to capture their formidable CEO's heart. Derek had handled it with his usual grace, neither intimidated nor arrogant, just himself, and Katherine had watched her two worlds merge with less friction than she had feared. The relationship continued to evolve, growing deeper and more integrated with each passing month. Derek started keeping clothes at Katherine's penthouse, transforming one of her spare rooms into a workspace where he could meet clients when he was in the downtown area. Rosie had her own room there too, decorated in the ocean blues and greens she loved, a space that was entirely hers, in a home that was learning to hold more than just Katherine's solitary existence. The penthouse stopped feeling like a museum of success and started feeling like a home, lived in and loved in. With Rosie's art projects on the refrigerator and Derek's books scattered across surfaces and the kind of comfortable mess that came from actual life being lived, Katherine found herself changing in small but significant ways. She left the office earlier some days, prioritizing dinner with Derek and Rosie over unnecessary meetings. She smiled more, laughed more easily, let herself be silly and imperfect in ways she hadn't allowed since she was young. Her employees noticed the difference, commenting that she seemed more approachable, more present, somehow more effective despite working fewer hours. The truth was that having something to come home to made the work itself more meaningful, gave her a reason beyond ambition and achievement. She was still driven, still brilliant in her field, but the sharp edges had softened into something more sustainable. Derek grew too, finding confidence in his own worth that had been eroded by years of struggling alone. Katherine encouraged him to raise his rates, to value his expertise appropriately, and connected him with clients who needed his skills and could afford to pay what he deserved. His business grew steadily, not to the scale of Katherine's company, but to a place of stability and respect, enough to support himself and Rosie comfortably without the constant anxiety about making rent. He started teaching weekend workshops on computer repair at the community college, sharing his knowledge with others, trying to build skills for better jobs. Katherine attended one of his classes once, sitting in the back and watching him teach with patience and enthusiasm, and fell in love with him all over again. Rosie flourished with the additional stability and support. Her grades improved, not because Katherine pushed, but because she had more resources and less stress about her father's financial struggles. The science fair project Katherine helped her develop won third place at the state level, an achievement that had Rosie beaming with pride and Derek taking approximately 500 photos. Katherine framed one of those photos, Rosie holding her ribbon, Derek's arm around her shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera, and kept it on her office desk where everyone could see it. When people asked about the photo, she told them proudly that this was her family, and the words felt true in a way that transcended legal definitions or traditional structures. There were still difficult moments, still people who made assumptions or comments that stung. But Katherine had learned something valuable. Other people's opinions couldn't change what she knew to be true. She loved Derek and Rosie. They loved her, and they had built something real together, despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. The company continued to thrive, the relationship continued to deepen, and Katherine discovered that she could have both. Not perfectly, not without effort, but genuinely and fully. The either-or choice she had been presented with her entire life had been a false dichotomy all along. On the 1-year anniversary of their first coffee shop meeting, Derek took Katherine and Rosie on a camping trip to the mountains. Katherine had never been camping, had initially balked at the idea of sleeping on the ground and being away from Wi-Fi. But Derek had insisted it would be good for her, would give her perspective. He had been right. Sitting around a campfire under a sky full of stars, Rosie asleep in the tent behind them, Derek's hand warm in hers. Katherine felt a peace she had been chasing through every achievement and accolade. This was enough. This was everything. The mountains didn't care about her net worth or her business strategies, and in that moment, neither did she. Derek had asked her, quietly so as not to wake Rosie, if she had any regrets. Katherine had thought about the question seriously, considering the professional costs, the public scrutiny, the ways her life had been irrevocably changed by loving him. Then she had looked at his face in the firelight, weathered and kind, and entirely familiar, and told him the only regret she had was waiting so long to find this, to believe she deserved it. He had kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Katherine had tasted smoke and marshmallows and the promise of tomorrow. When they pulled apart, Derek had whispered that he loved her, not the CEO or the public figure, but her, Katherine, with all her strengths and fears and complicated history. She had said it back, the words feeling like a vow. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening. There would be more challenges, more people who questioned their relationship, more moments of doubt and difficulty. But Katherine had learned that she was strong enough to weather it, that Derek's love was steady enough to trust, that Rosie's presence in her life was a gift she never wanted to take for granted. She had spent 58 years building an empire, proving her worth through achievement and success, believing that was all she was allowed to want. Derek and Rosie had shown her a different kind of wealth, one measured in Sunday morning pancakes and goodnight hugs, and the comfort of being truly known by people who chose to stay. Back in the city, life continued with its new rhythms. Katherine still led board meetings with unshakable authority, still made decisions that shaped the company's direction, still commanded respect in every room she entered. But she also left those rooms and went home to Derek cooking dinner, while Rosie did homework at the kitchen table, to a life that was messy and loud, and nothing like the pristine solitude she had known before. The contrast no longer felt like a conflict, but like balance. Two parts of herself that had finally learned to coexist. She was CEO and partner, mentor and friend, ambitious and content, proving that the world's rigid categories had been wrong about what women like her could have. The story of Katherine Hayes and Derek Foster became, in time, less scandalous and more simply accepted. New gossip replaced theirs. New controversies captured attention, and they were allowed to exist without constant scrutiny. Some people remained disapproving, clinging to their judgments about age and class and appropriateness, but their voices grew quieter as the relationship proved its staying power. Katherine stopped caring about those voices, stopped giving them power over her choices. She had learned the lesson Derek had been trying to teach her all along. The people who mattered would understand, and the people who didn't understand didn't matter. In the end, what Katherine and Derek had built together was revolutionary only because the world had decided it should be impossible. A successful woman in her late 50s finding love with a working-class single father shouldn't have been scandalous, but it was, because it challenged assumptions about worth and deserving, about who got to be happy and under what conditions. By refusing to hide, by insisting on the validity of their love despite opposition, they had changed the conversation in small but significant ways. Other women in Katherine's position reached out to her, sharing their own stories of being told they were too successful for love, thanking her for proving it was possible to have both. Katherine had never set out to be anyone's inspiration or role model. She had simply been a woman trying to navigate the impossible standards placed on successful women, trying to figure out if she was allowed to want softness and partnership alongside professional achievement. The answer, she had discovered, was yes, not because anyone gave her permission, but because she claimed it for herself. Derek had been the catalyst, but the courage had come from within, from the part of her that was tired of apologizing for taking up space, for wanting more, for refusing to shrink herself to fit other people's comfort. Years later, when asked about the secret to her success both professionally and personally, Katherine would smile and say it was learning to trust herself more than she feared judgment. She would talk about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who saw your full humanity, who valued you for more than what you could do for them. She would mention Derek and Rosie without hesitation, crediting them with teaching her that vulnerability was strength, that letting people in didn't diminish her, but expanded her capacity for everything: joy, creativity, resilience, love. And she would emphasize that the most radical act a successful woman could commit was insisting on her own happiness, regardless of who thought she deserved it. The legacy Katherine built extended beyond TechVision's innovations or market success. She became known as the CEO who proved you could have it all, but not without fighting for it, not without being willing to risk everything you had built for the things that truly mattered. Young women entering the corporate world saw in her a different kind of possibility, not the cold, solitary climb to the top they had been warned about, but a path that allowed for love and connection, and the messy, beautiful complexity of a full life. She received letters from women who said her example had given them courage to pursue relationships they had been told were inappropriate, to prioritize their happiness alongside their careers, to believe they deserved both. Derek continued to be Derek, steady, kind, unimpressed by the attention that occasionally came their way. He raised Rosie with the same devoted attention, supported Katherine through difficult board meetings and company crises, taught his computer classes and fixed laptops, and lived his life with quiet integrity. He never tried to become something he wasn't, never felt the need to match Katherine's professional success or prove himself worthy of her love. His gift was simply being himself, consistently and without apology, showing Katherine that she was loved not for what she achieved, but for who she was, beneath all the accomplishments. Rosie grew into a remarkable young woman, carrying lessons from both her father and Katherine into her own ambitions. She pursued marine biology with the same fierce dedication Katherine brought to business, the same patient persistence Derek demonstrated in his work. She spoke openly about having two parental figures who loved her in different ways, about being grateful for the expanded family her father's courage had created. In interviews for college applications, she wrote about learning that families could be built from choice and commitment rather than just biology, that the strongest bonds were often the ones people fought hardest to protect. The boardroom where Katherine had once stood with Derek, facing judgment and skepticism, eventually held a different kind of meeting. After a decade of continued growth and success under her leadership, the board voted unanimously to name the company's new research facility after her, the Katherine Hayes Innovation Center. At the dedication ceremony, Katherine stood at the podium with Derek and Rosie beside her, no longer hidden or separated from her professional life, but integrated fully into who she was. In her speech, she talked about innovation requiring courage, about the importance of challenging assumptions, about building futures that made space for all kinds of love and all kinds of excellence. She looked out at the crowd of employees, board members, industry leaders, and saw acceptance where there had once been judgment, respect where there had been skepticism. But more importantly, she felt Derek's hand in hers, felt Rosie's proud smile, and knew that the real innovation hadn't been in technology or business strategy. It had been in refusing to accept the limitations others tried to place on her life, in daring to believe that success and happiness weren't mutually exclusive, in choosing love even when the world said she was too old, too successful, too intimidating to deserve it. The question that had hung over their relationship from the beginning, whether two people the world called mismatched could make it work, had been answered definitively. Not through grand gestures or perfect romance, but through daily choices to show up for each other, to weather criticism together, to build a life that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment. They had proven that love wasn't about matching on paper, about meeting external criteria for compatibility, but about finding someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway, who made you braver and softer and more yourself than you could be alone. Katherine Hayes had built an empire, shattered glass ceilings, and proved that women could lead with excellence and authority. But her greatest act of courage, the thing she would be remembered for most by those who truly knew her, was daring to love Derek Foster, despite every voice that said it was impossible, inappropriate, beneath her. In choosing him, she had chosen herself, had insisted on her right to a full life, had demonstrated that the most revolutionary thing a powerful woman could do was refuse to sacrifice her heart on the altar of other people's expectations. And in being chosen by her, Derek had shown the world that worthiness wasn't measured in salary or status, but in the steady constancy of showing up, of loving without conditions, of being brave enough to let someone extraordinary see your ordinary, beautiful truth. Their story wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real, built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine affection, and the radical belief that everyone deserves love, regardless of age or achievement, or the opinions of people who think they know better. And in the end, that was the only story worth telling, not of a CEO who lowered herself or a single dad who rose above his station, but of two people who found each other across the artificial divides the world creates, who looked at those divides and decided love was worth more than compliance, who built a family from courage and choice and the simple, profound act of choosing each other every single day, no matter who was watching or what they had to say about it.